Some of the cultivars, like interspecific hybrid honeycomb, will start blooming early mid July and keep going in full force until the frost, basically. If you're careful about watering it occasionally and deadheading it to keep flushing forward the flowers, it'll put on a whole display basically until the end of October.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. We are in the midst of summer, folks, and as you know, it's hot and it's dry, and it's really hard to get the plants that are going to provide the resources for pollinators at this time of year, especially when it comes to shrubs. There's not a lot of shrubs that really grow and bloom through this time of year. One that is widely grown across the United States is butterfly bush, which is in the genus Buddleja. Now, there are some problems with butterfly bush. Under certain conditions, it can become an invasive shrub. And that has led breeders to the ingenious solution of making sterile varieties or making hybrids that have been assumed to be sterile. There's an open question. Do these sterile varieties provide resources for pollinators still after getting the sterility built into them? And are they really even sterile? And to help us answer those questions, we have Cara Stills from the Ornamental Plant Breeding Program here at Oregon State University. She manages the lab in the greenhouse space, and she also is an instructor here at Oregon State University. And the Ornamental Plant Breeding Program is super impressive here at OSU. They work with over 55 taxa of woody perennials, and one of their major goals is reducing the fertility of cultivars that are invasive, and in turn bringing to our gardens plants that are really hardy and resilient but don't have these ecological problems. So in this episode, we're going to hear about research that Cara did when she was doing her master's. It's had a bearing on, or is in the process of having an impact on, how we regulate sterility in butterfly bush. So without further ado, let's gather around all those inflorescence of butterfly bush this week on pollination. Hi, Cara. Welcome to Pollination.
Hi, Anthony. Great to be here.
There are people in our audience who may not know what Buddleja is. Can you walk us through where it comes from, where it originates from, and what are some of the different varieties and what do they look like?
Right. So, as far as what you might be most familiar with Buddleja, you probably come across butterfly bush out at nurseries and landscapes around here. And that's a specific species that's actually Buddleja davidii and a few
Okay.
interspecific hybrids on the market. And that species is actually from the Sino-Himalayan region in southeast China. So it is very not native here to Oregon. But there's
Okay.
actually a lot of different species that people use in the background of some of the interspecific cultivars. So those would be cultivars bred from a couple different species together. Some come from that same region in China. Others come from actually South America. There's a few. And those range just like the the Chinese versions. So you can get all different looks of them, from really, really large species with purple, white, pink, even kind of magenta bordering on red flowers. And then some of
Mm-hmm.
the South American species actually have interesting tangerine, orange, and yellow colors. And then, as far as the
Oh,
cultivars you might be familiar with, there's a range of sizes from just about to your knees or smaller and way over your head large. So, quite a bit of range.
okay. So Davidii is the most common, but there you said there's interspecific hybrids. So there's other species and they're hybridized. Is that the primary kind of parental stock for most of the varieties? That makes sense.
I'd say about half the varieties would be straight Buddleja Davidii. Most of the varieties that you'd see at just the garden center, something like Blue Chip or Miss Molly, are interspecific hybrids from, 2 to 4 species I've noticed. So, other common species in there from China include Buddleja lindleyiana and Buddleja asiatica is another one that's more commonly used. And then Buddleja globosa from South America is the most commonly used South American species.
Okay, thanks so much for setting that up, and I just love that there's this range of colors out there.
Mm.
And I know you have experience with them, and your experience comes in a kind of strange direction. Oregon has regulations around Buddleja varieties that can be sold in the state. So before we set up your work and your interest in this topic, can you walk us through what the current law is?
Yeah, and currently and this is kind of in the works of changing right now as the result of the work. But right now, Buddleja davidii is the only species that's regulated basically because of the invasive threat, especially that we see in Oregon in the coastal counties in riparian ecosystems. So currently, it is a Class B noxious weed in Oregon, which means that the sale, propagation, and movement of the species is banned in production. However, because it's a really popular garden plant that people keep asking for, that producers like to produce because it's also very easy to grow, the ODA made an exemption to that ban back in 2009, I believe. And that allows any of the Buddleja davidii species that exhibit a 98% reduction in fertility back on the market, and they also allowed any interspecific hybrid at all back on the market.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. So that I can see where this one might ask the question, why is that sufficient? 98%, lack of fertility seems like a lot. And I suppose, but the other one, the hybrids, you still it sort of doesn't get around this question of whether it will escape and become invasive. So tell us how your research well, yeah, so why isn't that sufficient, and how does this lead into the research questions that you're posing?
So, because there haven't well, one of the main insufficiencies is that there isn't a body that regulates this. This is all based on breeder reports for the 98% reduction in fertility bit. And
Oh, okay.
yeah, and, usually that's sufficient and they don't lie on purpose or any of that.
Okay.
But the main loophole that we were interested in was that bit about all interspecific hybrids being allowed back on the market because there isn't any specific documentation or wasn't until now about whether that is sufficient to reduce fertility all of the time. So the
Mhm.
question is, are interspecific hybrids all reduced fertility, or are they as much of a range as the usual Buddleja davidii species itself? So, yeah, our main question was what's the fertility of the interspecific hybrids in the first place?
Tell us a little bit about your research design. How did you go about answering that question?
So, we collected 34 different cultivars of different Buddleja from the really, really invasive threat like Black Knight, Manho Blue, and then a bunch of different interspecific hybrids with varying parentage. And then we also included a lot of the work that has been specifically done to reduce fertility, projects like Blue Chip, like the whole chip series. So we
Okay.
collected those 34 cultivars, put them out in a block, and as far as fertility testing goes, that was mostly like sowing seeds off of each cultivar and counting how many seedlings came up from that. Or rather than seeds, like whole inflorescences in the case where there weren't seeds. And then
Okay.
we were also interested in the question about whether or not pollinators had a preference between the low fertility cultivars and the high fertility cultivars. So we included some of that work as well.
Oh, I can see how that might be the case. You may have a variety that doesn't produce nectar, and therefore that is the sterility mechanism that, there's no pollen transfer by insects or something like that, or just by happenstance, it impacts something that makes it attractive to pollinators. Okay. Well, let's start with the first question.
Sure.
Was your hypothesis that these interspec I mean, maybe the hypothesis that the interspecific hybrids are a suitable, as the law states, a suitable protection against them becoming invasive or reducing fertility. Did you find that?
No. In fact, both years we found that they were interspecific hybrids that were within the top 3 in fertility. And I
Oh, no.
yeah, so that's not a metric that you can use point blank. But we did find both years that of all the cultivars below the 98% fertility level, that threshold, those were interspecific hybrids. So that just kind of illustrates that, like, no, it's not a guarantee. You still have to measure whether or not they're fertile, but it is a good mechanism to make close to sterile plants that we can use in the future to kind of like broaden the ornamental value of sterile butterfly bush if we want to.
I suppose the other good news is you're able to validate what the breeders are reporting for these low fertility values.
Mhm. Yeah, for most of them on the market. We might see some shifts. I don't even know if that's in the near future, but we did
Mhm.
find some kind of contradictory values, particularly for some of the cultivars that were allowed back in the state just under that interspecific loophole. There are some issues with that we will want to address as the regulation tightens, but yeah. We're also kind of like working hand in hand with the ODA and growers at this point just because, it takes a couple of years to grow plants to a saleable size, and we don't want to just throw everything out and cost a bunch of money to our number one agronomic sector in Oregon. So we're kind of slow stepping into that, I think.
I also just imagine this is a popular plant for gardeners, and growers are geared up with a lot of material. And so if they're going to make these transitions to, really reduce fertility, then it's going to take a little bit of time for them to kind of move to that position.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, so that brings us to the second question. Is this do we undermine the attractiveness? So these are great plants. They bloom at a time of year when there's not a lot blooming. They can be covered with, of course, butterflies, but also bees.
Mhm.
Did sterility correlate with the attractiveness to bees?
Very well. Yeah. Yeah, so it's very dependent, and I'm still kind of working on the statistics to really understand, like, which traits are most aligned with pollinator attraction, but as far as fertility by counting seedlings, not really. And one of the interesting observations I had while in the course of this work is that I noticed one, it's mostly generalist pollinators out amongst the plots, mostly honeybees. We got a lot of bombus boss, so
Mhm.
generalist types things. And two, they don't really seem to forage pollen off of it that often. It's most nectar collection, which
Mhm.
isn't affected by the sterility in this case. Yeah. And I didn't really see that much of a correlation between nectar volume and pollinator attraction, which is something I also measured. But season length, so some of the cultivars like interspecific hybrid honeycomb will start blooming, early mid July and keep going in full force until the frost, basically. So
Wow.
yeah, you can go if you're careful about watering it occasionally and deadheading it to keep flushing forward the flowers, it'll put on a whole display basically until the end of October. And and that cultivar was actually the most attractive one to Bombus Foss out of the entire plot there. So,
I have a question. So I guess with the nectar column and the nectar volume, that's one component. But if you have a plant that puts out a lot of nectar but blooms quickly and is done, the total amount of sugar it's producing per plant over time may be a variety like honeycomb that blooms so long. So what I guess honeycomb had both a lot of nectar per flower, but a lot of flowers over time.
so I kind of wonder about that as well.
Okay. Well, okay, that's really great. And I guess the other thing with butterfly bush is it is deadheadable. That you can really extend bloom by just trimming off as soon as the flowers start to senescence a bit.
Yeah, and that's a great thing to do if you're concerned about having an invasive cultivar in your backyard as it is
Oh,
anyway, is just to deadhead before they get a chance to set a ton of seed.
Oh,
Um,
you get the double benefit. You just get extended bloom and you get rid of any seeding potential.
mhm.
Wow, that's great. I guess you were talking a little bit about, Oregon perhaps tightening its regulations and, what might I guess the good news is that for consumers that love butterfly bush, and they certainly have a role to play in any garden, they're still gonna be made available in Oregon. But, I guess it means maybe that some varieties that people currently have may start to slowly phase out.
Yeah, and I don't wanna put the horse ahead of or the wagon ahead of the horse on that
Yeah, yeah.
one, because I think it is still a little bit of a touchy subject, but, I mean, it's nothing that gardeners really have to worry about ripping out of their own backyard. I'd say just if you're physically able to keep up with the deadheading, like, that should be fine. It's just that you might not always see the same cultivars available at the nurseries, but hopefully a few new cultivars too. That's something we're working on right now in the breeding program is one of the targets is a compact yellow using the honeycomb genetics, and another one of the targets is like a compact, really, really dark purple.
No.
Um,
Well, what would compact be? How big a plant are we talking about? Because butterfly bush can be bigger than yourself kind of plant.
Yeah. Well, and the only yellows available on the market are those bigger than me plants. But, we'll try for like knee to waist high about, I'd say, on those.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for giving us this lowdown on this really important ornamental plant that I think a lot of gardeners love, and I think this is really heartening to hear that through this research, not only are we going to be able to continue to enjoy these plants in our gardens, but we'll do so in a way that has far less environmental impacts.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the goal. And I think we found some really exciting stuff here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.